Let's begin. Let's get into it. We have Michael here today. Michael, listen, let me just off the bat before I even allow you to bless us with some of your insight and knowledge. This has been a great one for us in community because I am a facilitator in my 30s from the Bronx who happens to love sci-fi and all that comes with it and all of the notions of how we exist simultaneously. I'm in all that. And folks aren't necessarily in that, as Ron has shared too. He's not the only one that's kind of had that experience. And in spite of whatever lens, this has been such a great read for us. So, we'd love to have you here. We're so excited to ask questions. I'd love for you to start off by, if you want to share anything with us, you think we should know our name. And if you don't, then we can actually just open questions to the group. If folks don't have questions, I have one or two, but as Ron named, this is our book club, right? So.
Yeah, I just want to share, wow, I've been looking forward to this for some time. Thank you so much. I do want to share, just like that Chicago and New York love, some of the ideas of the first chapters in this book. A lot of the stories behind the Dominicana come from my tia, who born and raised in Queens. She's a Dominicana, Afro-Dominicana, and so she was kind of a light that I thought about as I started to write this. So just want to share that Chicago, New York love.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Particularly before I open up some questions, I think it's great to name right now something that's come up for us since one of our first sessions. Your ability to write of the diaspora and that, let me preface something else. We are a book club, yes, and books are highly institutional and academic. But I like to think when I'm facilitating One Book, One Bronx in collaboration with Ron, is that we're also here to circumnavigate our lives as Black and Brown people through the stories told in this book. And I think what was beautiful, which is not always the case for us, like when we're set in a particular city or in a particular environment, then there's a particular demographic that comes with that. And being of the diaspora, being of Latinidad, being of African people, we can always say, oh yeah, my family relates to that, but the story may not be necessarily talking about where we're from. In this story, we have folks from everywhere and it seems to resonate. And I guess I would just like to ask, your intention behind writing of the diaspora in this way, if you can share.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that question and framing it in the diaspora. So much of the stories, I always say so my dad is from Ecuador and his family is Quechua, indigenous, and obviously Latino. My abuelita, my grandmother, was indigenous. And so there's diasporas inside of diasporas in Ecuador where you have indigenous peoples who were rooted out and displaced and ending up in Chicago. My dad and my mother's family is Lithuanian Jewish. And so they're coming from the other side of the world, but they're coming with stories of diaspora and diaspora being, from Pograms and sort of being from Shetels in Lithuania. And I always think back to and I didn't even come to terms with that until maybe the book was finished. But for me, my first literature was the dinner table. It was the ways in which my grandfather, who, sort of had those memories of growing up with his dad from Lithuania. It was from my father, who was coming from Ecuador. And I started to, I think when I became older, I started to realize that my first literature was about exile and diaspora at the dinner table. Sometimes it was real funny, sometimes Tio is visiting from Ecuador and, they're drinking into the night and you get all those stories from home. And sometimes it's sad and sometimes it's difficult. And I think at the end of the day, a lot of this is, not only my love story to, my personal love for science fiction, but also my sort of love letter to exiles and how we all sort of ended up at the same dinner table. And that was my first literature. It wasn't until college where people were like, this is what you have to read to understand America. I was like, but y'all should come to my house for dinner and listen to my dad.
Absolutely.
So that was the literature that I grew up with. And I hope some of that comes across into that. But again, I couldn't even make those connections until the book was finished and tried to write the book. It wasn't until I was, on a second or third draft where I was like, oh, this is my dinner table. This is, I hope, shows a little bit of that. And the book is also, I do want to share, it's also dedicated to a very close friend of mine who passed when I was young, and his name was Matt Davis. And he too would always talk about the diaspora. His family, like myself, he was mixed. He was Black in Iowa, and his mother's family was from Kansas, and they were white. You know, we would take on these long walks together. We were just really close friends and just trying to come to terms in sort of like 1990s America about like, what does it mean to be mixed? And so like, what does it mean to be an exile inside of an exile, where like one group neither group might fully accept you. And you know, he was lost way too young, but he was involved in sort of that Afro punk movement that started like in the 90s and the early aughts. And, you know, I really, when I sat down to write this, I wanted to feel like I was at the dinner table with my family, but also like walking with Matt and just like telling him stories. And so I think what emerged is sort of that structure of like not being able to sit still, because I grew up, you know, in Chicago with people who can never sit still. You know, we've been pushed and moved, and so I feel like that's the way I understand storytelling, is largely because that's how I grew up with it at the dinner table.
Right. Thank you so much for calling Matt into the space and for that gorgeous analogy of the literacy being the dinner table, or literature as the dinner table, and what that is. Because I mean, it's important for us as we think of the medium of storytelling, particularly because you tend to shout out a lot of prolific like writers and thinkers and artists. And I think in the book thus far and where we are, we're halfway through, as Ron named. And there's a lot of like mention and reference. And I think that's important to name the connection between like those prolific folks and ourselves. Literally is that like that is written down what we've already heard at the dinner table, right? That's things relevant and true. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
I have tons of questions. I could do this all night, but it's not about me. I'd love to open it up to my brilliant, wonderful co-readers. Does anyone have any questions? It doesn't have to be a question. It could be an idea, a book pitch. It could be a compliment. Anything you'd like to ask Michael?
Yes, I have a question. This is Joan in Ohio.
Hey, Joan.
Hi. And this is maybe further in the book than the beginning, but when Saul and Javier are speaking, there are no quotation marks. Did you do that for a reason, or?
Yeah. I had some debate back and forth with my editor about it for sure. But yeah, a lot of like thinking about, and I love that question, and a lot of thinking about how to sort of frame dialogue it occurred to me at some point, again, even going back to that idea of the dinner table, that quotation marks felt like I was separating the person's voice from the narrative itself. And I wanted to, there are quotation marks in the historical section.
Okay.
You know, because we can, I think when we think of history, we think of a structure for the narrative, but in the more present section, I kept thinking about like the ways in which my familia talks, the ways in which we walk through the space, is that the story is a living object. And I don't think I wanted to separate that by quotation marks. I had similar thinking too by not putting Spanish language in italics. I grew up with books where like if someone was speaking Spanish, it was in italics. And you know, me being growing up a little bit bilingual, I was always like, why is the language separate? Like I don't talk to my dad in italics. Like, and I think for me, so much of the heart of the story is oral storytelling, people having and maybe some of that comes across a little bit later too, but people having space and time to tell their own story felt really important to me. So setting it aside in quotation marks felt like I didn't want that. I didn't want them to be grammatically separate. I wanted them to feel like the story itself was the living pages. It can get a little confusing. I know that. Like, I know it can get like, I get readers email me and they're like, use some quotation marks. And my third reason, and sort of my ultimate reason, is in a lot of Latin American literature, there's no quotation marks for some of those same reasons. Yeah. And so in Spanish language literature, a lot of books, some of my favorite books have abandoned quotation marks for some of those same reasons. Yeah. I love that question. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Ms. Jones, one of our gems. Everyone is, but
A friend once asked me, he wanted to put some Spanish up, like just a few sentences in Spanish, but he was afraid that he should translate them. And I said, well, in real life, if two Spanish people are speaking, they don't translate for everybody who's around them.
Correct.
You know, they just speak to each other. So I told him, you know, don't translate. If we need to know, we will figure it out. Plus, usually, you know, within the narrative, you can kind of figure out what people are saying, even if it's not in your language.
Yeah.
So.
I knew when growing up, I knew I was in trouble when I put that air to the door and my parents were behind the door talking in Spanish about me. I was like, oh, I got to translate fast. But yeah, exactly. I agree with that.
it certainly feels italicized then, doesn't it? Whoa, what's happening? Thank you so much. Any other questions, thoughts, ideas, comments?
So I have a question about the title of the first chapter. Why is it Dominica and not Adana?
Yeah, you know, I thought about that a lot too, because she gets named kind of later. I thought about in a way how we like, and I think going back and it was named sort of, I almost named it like right away. Like I knew I wanted to write about La Dominicana, and I felt like in some ways we like mythologize our ancestors, right? We give them these like big sort of placeholders in history and life, and there's some references to her as La Dominicana as opposed to just Adana. And I'm still wrapping my head around how like Adana still like feels to me like all the lost writers that I never got to read as a kid, like all the lost writers from like the Caribbean and Latinidad, like you had said in the beginning, like all those writers who wrote and whose works disappeared. So it felt bigger than just her name, even though she is named. I really love that because I think about the ways just in our own personal lives, because, you know, you had mentioned, Parla, that, you know, how do we think about our own personal lives through the lens of these books? And, you know, I'll share like my abuelito in Ecuador, who I named and who passed away last year at 102. Like his name is Napoleon Zapata, and he was this like union organizer, and he was this farmer in the Andes, where my dad grew up, in this small pueblito in Ecuador, in the mountains, high up in the mountains. And I was lucky as an adult to spend some substantial time with him and interview him and like be friends with my abuelito, you know, that as adults, and it was a beautiful thing. But when I think about him, pardon me, and when my family talks about him, it gets old school, and they all refer to him as Don Napo. Don Napo. Like, and that goes way back. That's like 1800s talk. Like you're saying, like Don Napo, you know, he was a union organizer, and he took on sort of that real respect in that area, in that town. And to this day, like when I'm texting with my primos, you know, they live in Ecuador, sometimes it's abuelito, sometimes it's Don Napo. And I think about like we're already mythologizing sort of his memory.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Jeanette, too, because I think also just hearing you say that, it's like referring to our ancestors within their title almost. We see that a lot in sort of maybe white fantasy fiction where folks are of title, right? And they like represent the lands. And I just think that's like a fantastic way to sort of mythologize, you know what I mean? So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Ayana, I see that hand up.
I'm sorry, I'm a little late, so you may have addressed this already, but what was your process? Because I think still enjoying trying to get through the book, but what was your process? Because it seemed like every page there was something historical. There was something I had to run and look up, or I didn't know about, or I had to kind of figure out how you got there. Like, what was your process?
Real long and real messy. No, you know, I think like I've always been, you know, there's something I've been thinking about a lot, especially as I'm kind of like considering I'm working on another book which takes place in the near future, and I've always had this sort of fascination with like literary, like not historical fiction and science fiction, but at some point it occurred to me that like we don't know that we live in the past, and we don't know that we live in the future. To someone else, we're living in the future. To someone else, we're living in the past. And so I think for me, like the process of sitting down and writing was always like trying to figure out, even page by page, in what ways do the past and the future kind of collide in the moments. And for me, like the moment is always like the page, regardless if it's set in the future or the past. But like in what ways can the past and the future collide on the page? And so I think my process too is just like, I just grew up like really fascinated with history and really fascinated with the future. And so like the early drafts had a mess of both ideas about both. And I tried to retain some of that mess to be transparent. I love writing and reading things that feel like they're a little bit messy, like American fiction is so nice and structured, and I love it. There's so much about Latin American fiction where there's a lot of collision of structure and the past and the future. And so my process was long. I Lost Book of Adana Moreau took about all in all, from like start to finish, took about like 6-7 years to write and research. I previously in my 20s and early 30s, I wrote for theater. Theater cannot be, it could mess. It has to be like, I got to hand it off to like people who have to have like a precision to it. And so I feel like I maybe was also reacting to having worked for the stage for so long, where you turn in a play and people change it, which is great, but then like it has to be everything, every beat, every word has to have this like purpose. And maybe I was reacting to that a little bit, like to just try to build out a world that felt like as messy as our own lives. And I also feel like we all walk with like many worlds in us. We're just kind of walking about our day, and here we are talking about like abuelitos and our family histories, and for me it felt like our own day-to-day living can feel like it's full of the past and the future. So the way we project what we think the future will be. So that might not be the best answer. It might be a messy answer to some messier pages. But if I tried to do anything like sort of like on the craft page level, I think it was like trying to figure out ways in which the past and the future collide on the page.
So it's Jeanette. I have another question that might clarify it a little for me. So I was kind of jolted. We started in the 1920s in one chapter, and the next chapter we're in the 2000s. It's like, okay, how did that happen? What's going on here? And I don't read science fiction, so this is my first experience with science fiction. I go, okay, I don't get it.
Yeah, and I love, like, I grew up with science fiction, and I tried to like record. So I will say this, and I won't give too much away, but the whole main story itself, as far as what happens to Maxwell, what happens to Javier and Saul, all that is realism. Nothing science fiction happens, but they're all sort of like obsessed about, right? They're all sort of like obsessed with science fiction. So I felt like in revising and thinking about the book, I liked the idea of science fiction has so many, I'm sure, Paula, you see it all the time in fantasy and science fiction, time jumps that like are sort of like abrupt, right? And then you're sort of like left to sort of fill in the gaps. And again, I also think like, I think about that too, and just being in this conversation, thinking about the stories my abuelito Danapo would tell me, like, I would be with my iPhone. I'd go hang out at his house. I'd be texting my cousins, and then he was old school. He would literally say, in 1942, and like, okay, abuelito, I'm with you. Let's go. And it would, and he'd be telling me about when he was a kid and his union organizing in the 1970s. And I think just listening to him and the people around me in my life who like did all those kind of time jumps, it felt to me both messy but also comfortable. Maybe comfortable. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I also want to thank Ayana for asking that brilliant question, because I think I want to name for us as a group, and Ayana, if you want to add on to anything, please do. But I wanted to name this is something we've discussed as a group, how like, if you've never had an experience with science fiction before, sort of having these time jumps in this book is very like remnant of how science fiction expresses itself, right? And we spoke about current films that are out, like we were talking about Everywhere All at Once, which is a film that is nominated for Oscar, but it's a similar notion of like, okay, this is what I was gonna say, and you've affirmed it. It relieves the pressure, I think, now that we've heard this from you. And I think as a fan of science fiction, it sort of relieves the pressure of having to really feel like you need to keep a straight continuum of time, allowing yourself to go where the story presents you at the time. Yeah. And, so like, thank you, because like, it's, you know, and as Black and brown people, when is the luxury and the freedom for that real, even within like something pleasurable, like reading a book, right? Like, so even within that, like, I think it's an important practice for us. And I love that Ayana brought it up, because that was a real thing that we had to circumnavigate. And like, that's a beauty for me. That's just a beauty, you know?
Even just saying that, like, I think like I've been thinking more and more about how like colonialism like gave us this time. You know, like I think about my ancestors in Quechua and Inca. So like, it's my understanding that Inca time is a cycle. You know, the cycle, instead of like sort of like even chronological. And like even that clock, that sort of like clock that came with the, sort of like the British Empire, like I always think, and I think that's why one reason, and I tell my students this, one reason why I do think there's so many time jumps in science fiction, and it can feel like discordant, and it could feel like discombobulating. Surely I've read so many books where that's the case. But I think when I see science fiction, I trust if it's a person of color, indigenous, Latino, Black, and they're writing science fiction and they're doing this, I get this sensibility that like they're trying to reclaim time before colonialism. You know, they gave us this clock when they came here, and it's you don't experience time the same. You know, I would say that like even for Jewish peoples, like the ways in which stories are told in Jewish literature actually have quite a lot in common with Latino literature, because the sense of time, we weren't the colonizers, and so our sense of time is disjointed. Our senses of reality were changed when colonizers showed up. So I really want to, you know, just follow what you said, Paola. That makes a lot of sense to me.
It was me. It was the group. It wasn't me.
It was the group.
No, I think what you said is important, Paula, because I think 3/4 through the book, I started reading it differently, right? I think it's not up until tonight. I'm like, okay, why am I trying to create linear? Why am I doing this? Because I think, as I said, Michael, I think there's so many characters. Each person had a story. I'm like, well, maybe I should just be concentrating on that story and trying to figure out, well, what did he have to do with that one? And what did that one have to do with that one? And I think I just started reading it a little different.
I love that. Yeah. So taking it as is, right? Kind of, if you were in a time warp, what would you, I mean, someone's kind of seen half a Marvel film, I'm sure. What would you do? You'd have to just kind of like deal with whatever's in front of you until Captain America comes, I guess, right? But you'd have to, when the story comes, you kind of just take what's being given to you in that moment. Y'all are brilliant. I'd love to reopen the floor. Oh, I wanted to, Sharon had asked a question in the chat, if we can just take a moment. Could you elaborate how the book mimics oral storytelling within a written book?
Yeah, and that's something I felt like a little more conscious with for a couple reasons. I mean, I think number one, I worked as a playwright before I had written the novel, and I think just being able to hear someone's voice was real important to me. It was real important for me, like Ursula Le Guin, who I just adore. You know, she always says sort of like the storytelling from the United States is like the storytelling of empire. It's the storytelling of conflict. It's the storytelling of the individual defeating or circumnavigating or persevering, sort of that individual. A lot of storytelling in Latin America, and surely influenced by Quechua and indigenous peoples, and definitely like my dad's family, was a little bit more communal than that. And same thing with Jewish storytelling in Chicago. We have this famous oral historian here, Studs Terkel, who kind of shepherded what oral storytelling was for Americans. You know, he did something that I think was extraordinary. Is like, he has this book called Division Street. Division Street, back in the day, you have all the way at one end you have all the way from Puerto Rico and actually the Dominican Republic, and on the other end you'd have sort of like Ukrainian, and Division Street was just mad diverse in Chicago. And back in the day, he would walk down Division Street and record people's stories, and sort of this book kind of grew from that concept. And so you open up a book from Studs Terkel, and you get everyday Chicagoans telling their lives, telling their stories. And there was something beautiful about that in sort of like American literary history and journalistic history, because it was the first time where journalists, you know, post World War II, where journalists were like, we're going to record workers, we're going to record people, we're going to record. The vast majority of literature in society never gets written down. The vast majority of dinner table stories never get written down. And so Studs Terkel makes a real big argument that I always felt quite an affinity for, was that the nature of literature and storytelling itself, most of it exists outside of books. Most of it exists in the minds and hearts of people and the ways in which they tell stories. And I mad respect that. I've always loved that. And I was really consciously introducing even minor characters, wanted to try to the best of my ability to give them that space. You know, like they walk on the stage and they're not the primary character, but they get that breath, they get the audience, they get the space. And I also felt too like that kind of mimicked parallel universes, like everyone's a walking universe in a way. You know, we all got our worlds and stories in our heads. But I really consciously thought of Studs Terkel. A little bit of an Easter egg is that Saul's grandfather, Benjamin, was completely modeled after Studs Terkel. Sort of like my nudge to him. Yeah, but you know, I'll stop right there. But I really think it was really that was one conscious decision to really want to give working people and minor characters, make them feel like they have breath and space for life. I will share this with y'all. I had so many more that I had to the book was too big. It got too unwieldy. But you know, there's other books down the road, hopefully. But that was really important to me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that was beautiful. I'm thinking of
I'd like to say something.
Oh,
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I wanted to say that what has helped me to get through your book is imagining that I'm watching a film. And it feels very much like a film to me. And so I really have to take it in and close my eyes and imagine. Just reading a bit about the person that was, the writer that was in South America during the military and when his friend gets hurt. I mean, that was so vivid. It was like, whoo, you know. And the other thing, and us talking about time, last week I brought up the point about space. And there's a part where you talk about European space versus Latin American space, and I forget the other third one, but it really made me think about that. And I mentioned last week, it's like in architecture, you know, the way that, you know, Europeans will come in and set up a certain township versus how Africans do it or something. So I've been enjoying it. At initially, I felt like it was really all over the place. But once I began to kind of take it in more and also conversating with the group here, it's been helpful. So I've been more receptive, because initially it was a little difficult. But and I wanted to kind of know more about Adana. I was so sorry that she died so early, because I kind of wanted to know more about their love story and the father and so forth. But I understand, you know, it was your plot. So, you know, so it's been interesting. I've enjoyed it. And, you know, having gone to New Orleans, right just before COVID, you know, it made me think of New Orleans as a place, and how it is definitely a different energy there. But, you know, but my people are from Charleston, so it's similar.
I always thank you so much for that. I always say, like, I lived in New Orleans. I've been going ever since I've been like 19. I've been going, and like I showed up and I was like, it's a little bit of Ecuador a little bit of the Caribbean, you know, it's a bunch of the Caribbean, and I feel like
Right.
it partitioned my soul.
Mhm.
I feel like I could never forever, like I can't have a united soul because half is in New Orleans, the other half is in Chicago.
Mm.
But thank you for that. I think too, even like just New Orleans has a different space. The way
Sure.
time and space exists and the way people are able to inhabit that. And such a beautiful city. And people will stop you, strangers, you'll get their whole life story. You know, it's a really good place for readers and writers, I think.
Yeah. Thank you.
I wanted to say that I'm really finding this conversation helpful because it's making me understand, like what Ayana said earlier about my needing to have the story make sense, and like spending so much time, me spending so much time, like what's the connection between this story and that story, and what's the connection between this person, and why is he talking about this, and why did he, you know, include the story about Argentina, and even the way I'm speaking is the way I was experiencing it, like very frenetic, like I was experiencing the reading as I had said a couple of weeks ago. I felt like I had to catch my breath. You know, I was just like, you know, one story to the next, to the next, to the next. So this is very helpful in terms of, you know, like giving kind of, it allows me to just kind of give up that need to make sense. You know, like just let it flow, you know, just like let it flow over us, you know, all of the stories, you know, and however they you know, hit up against each other, or why they're even there. I really appreciated what you were saying about like literature, so much of literature not being written because literature is this telling of the stories of ordinary people. And it gives me a really profound insight into how you chose to write the book, and what you chose to challenge in terms of how a book is supposed to be written and how a book is supposed to be read. And I like that I've been kind of shaken out of my space of what I feel comfortable, how I feel comfortable reading a book.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I always felt that, like growing up in Chicago too, I you know, the neighborhood I grew up in, there was I grew up half in Chicago and half outside of the suburbs, but we all kind of moved together. First generation people. When I went to high school, there's just an enormous amount of first generation students from, you know, all my best friends to this day. The one thing I really love about like my family in New York and Chicago is like we're able to say like, ooh, you know, my friends from 30 years ago are coming over. You know, like it's like you have that like community that. But I did grow up around folks from India and a lot Assyrians from Iraq who were refugees from Iraq, from Ecuador, Colombia. And so I really appreciate that, what you were saying, because I felt like in some way, even just being able to replicate that a little bit, like the stories I grew up with and the kids I grew up with, we were all together sort of like trying to make sense out of our family stories, which from Iraq and from Bolivia and, you know, from Hungary and, you know, how does that work, you know, in a place like the Bronx? How does that work in a place like the north side of Chicago? I felt like in some ways I wouldn't know how to be a writer otherwise, I think, because of those experiences.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
You,
shaking the
you
room.
kind of referenced one of your previous answers that your focus is as a playwright. And I'm just wondering whether your editor had to sort of rein in your pace a bit, because it was going purposefully pretty fast, similar to how a play, and you kind of explained this, similar to how a play is paced.
Yeah.
And I was just like, hang on, Ron, you know, you're gonna, you know, stick with it, because it did feel like really quick early on, like the pacing of the book.
Yeah. I was just absolutely gifted with an editor who like exactly knew how and when to tell me to chill out. Like it's like I had I'm just really lucky for my editor at HarperCollins who saw when I would maybe push it too far and try to sort of rein in so it, you know, fulfills like the original intent and be intentful about it, but also not, you know, my agent too, they were really, like, I think they were really indicated where things they felt like were working or where it was too much. Given all the time and the space in the world, if you give me like a secondary character, I'm gonna like write a whole book about that person. Like, I'm just gonna be like, oh, I like this person, let's go with it. Which is, I think you're exactly right. Like, you know, writing for the stage, you know, sometimes I did comedy reviews or one acts or things like that, but you can put up 1 or 2 a year. I was really sort of frenetic about it with the people I worked with. And so the novels are slower. So I'm wondering if now that you're all saying it as out loud, I'm wondering if I'm trying to replicate the stage days a little bit and sort of mix it.
But it's not a bad pacing. It's just something like early on, you have to sort of refocus yourself that, you know, it's going to, but it does kind of slow down and become centered around a few characters. But early on, when you, in any book, when you don't know the exact direction the book will take, you have to just stick with it.
Yeah, we're like, don't change it. We just know that this is. I see that Paula has a question, so I wanted to make sure we get to her and then keep moving around.
Yeah, it's actually a secondary character question, and since you just mentioned it, which is, and it's really small, but I feel like there's like more there. So I wonder if you could talk about it. David Ellison shows up, I think, twice early and then late past where we've actually read. I was slow to get started in this and then I couldn't stop reading it. And he feels like, and I, you know, I did a little, you know, because I was really engaged by the novel. So I did, he comes from the Double Dealer, and that's a real thing. I found out, which I didn't know. And but he's a publisher, not an editor. It was interesting. You were just talking about your editors. Is there anything? He feels like an important, I mean, he is an important character, but he's kind of doing kind of building new voices in publishing and in books, unlike the Studs Terkel kind of also. I just wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, you know, there's always I had the opportunity to research a little bit about the Double Dealer and sort of there'll be mention later of like a literary magazine in Chicago that existed. And what always fascinated me is not only sort of like the writers that we never get to hear about, you know, the writers like Adana Moreau, but there was so much in the early 20th century. There was so much publishers and editors of small press, like you hear about today, the editors, and they go a little bit unsung. So David Ellison will pop up in a minor way later, but I feel like there's just these magic people who don't make a lot of money. They're workers just like everybody else, but they bend their lives towards trying to help artists or musicians or writers. And wanted to give a little nod to that in the same way librarians do. You know, during the Great Depression, I found in some research, librarians, my God, what they did. You know, when people couldn't go to school, they were teaching kids how to read. When people didn't have food, they were organizing first aid response, you know, what we today would call like first aid responses. And back in the day, it was just trying to feed your neighborhood. And so there's all the, you know, I will admit there's always a little bit of the socialist in me who's like, who were the unsung heroes who were feeding people? Who were the people who sacrificed, you know, their own finances and their own sort of lives and to get people published and help them out. So that's just a little bit of that. It's a little bit of that. I hope in a way, like, I think I didn't realize until the book was done, I think, but more in having this conversation, I'm really loving this because more intentfully, I wanted to like make a point that like, in some ways, like the individual never perseveres by themselves. You know, we get so much of that story in American literature about the individual persevering, and it just doesn't happen. We need each other. We don't have to like each other. Sometimes our neighbors, you know, sometimes we need something from our neighbor to help us out. we don't have to, but we need each other, and it's without those bonds that nobody perseveres. And I think that runs counter. I think Ursula Le Guin, like, again, she says it so perfectly when she says our narrative is one of empire. It's the one of the individual. And I always felt uncomfortable sort of centering the individual and when I wrote for stage, and I think when I'm writing for fiction.
That's wonderful. So much.
Well, that's kind of interesting, because you did give shout out to some authors that most people have never heard of, and what comes to mind is John Henrik Clarke. How many people know about him?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Oh, I do love. I do. Yeah. I mean, so many writers. I think too. So many of the writers in this book, and you'll see some more, were imaginary. They were made up, like Adana Moreau, but there's so many real ones that I just adore, and just wanted to sneak them in. You know, my background is I wrote for theater, but during all those years I was a high school teacher. I taught high school, Chicago Public Schools, for 11, 12 years. That was my sort of like passion. That was my first career. And I'm telling you, the funnest days were like, I got a list of writers and I'm going to try and sell them to you all. Like, I got the books. We're going to read these stories together. So there's a little bit of that high school bookseller in me that's always going to want to, like, just put books inside a book. Just put books inside of books.
Yeah, and I think some Greek mythology you kind of mentioned, you know, it's like, okay.
Yeah. That's the high school teacher in me, I think. I mean, I love literature, but yeah, I love literature, obviously, but
now I understand better.
yeah. I want to avoid all that pretension and just have y'all buy other books. You know, like,
that's certainly what it felt like. Oh, we can just also read these other books too.
Yeah.
Thank you for naming that, and for again, just creating the connection to, like, how one story, all of these stories are interconnected as they come in the way we face them. I just wanted to name, before we continue with questions, that this is a group of public school educators, writers, editors, and librarians. So we're talking, you know, we are very much in that lens. And I think that's why probably we're appreciating so much of this.
Mi gente. That's
Palante, period. Yeah. So first I wanted to go, we have two questions in the chat. First, Jacqueline had named, and I think you've sort of already named the answer here, but let's hone in, because I love these two examples that she pulls up. There are several journeys in this book, from the gray-eyed man's search through worlds for Adama and Maxwell's search for self and a kind of home. Can you respond?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think in, like, writing, like, the summaries of, you know, there was an impulse in me where I was just going to, like, write the whole science fiction book in the book, but that got too much. And I was like, let's write, you know, and I had a lot of fun writing the summaries. But I thought, like, it's a counterpoint. I've been thinking more recently too, in working on another book, is that, you know, if we have a story of sort of like people who are exiled, sort of what does home sort of mean to them? And it's interesting, like, there's almost like this sense, I think, for some of us, you know, if you're first generation, or surely, you know, even my dad would talk about it, is like, as an immigrant, you kind of always feel like you're in two places at once. You're like quantum. It's like quantum entanglement is like two particles, no matter how separate, it's kind of a little bit of a science term, like, no matter how separate they are, they're entangled, they still somehow interact. It's this really weird scientific theory, but I feel like that's how I grew up. You know, I was quite blessed as a kid to have connections to Ecuador. You know, my dad just didn't come to Chicago, but my parents, when they got sick of me in the summer, would send me to Ecuador. So I would go hang out with my cousins, go hang out with my abuelito on the farm. And, you know, I'm so grateful for that. But then I'd come back to Chicago. And so there's always this, you know, feeling like being simultaneously existing somehow in two places at once. And so I felt like, as first generation peoples, as immigrants, like, I feel like you just kind of grow up with that sensibility that you're always searching for what it means to be home. Home is, you know, where your familia is, but if your familia is in two continents, it's a little tricky. I do feel blessed though, because with Latin America, we're on the same time zone more or less, so I can have those close connections. But you're always like in two places at once. So the only way I could kind of think about how does that, what happens when you're writing science fiction is parallel universes. You know, these sort of science fiction stories of like trying to enter as many places as possible until you find the one that you feel like is home.
Beautiful. Thank you. You got that, Miss Jackie? I also want to name that Gwinnell had asked. Before I name Gwinnell's question, I also want to say to that, what you just said, Michael. That is probably a universal sentiment. I won't say experience, but like a universal sentiment for like folks within the Western United States as well, right? Like if you are lucky enough to be able to trace back where your family is from, I know many people of my generation and those older than me that also maybe were able to go back and be with family for the summers or be away for the holidays and have your existence wasn't the word, but have yourself exist in two places at once, right? Like we navigate where we're from culturally, and we navigate Western United States identity that look like. So that just really connects, and I wanted to highlight that. Gwinnell names. I'm wondering if you're introducing more mystery elements as well. Saul didn't tell Javier about the math professor, so I'm interested in why this occurs and if there'll be more to this, or if sci-fi is a cover for the mystery.
I like that.
Good, right? We're good here.
I like that. You know, I think too, like, you don't, I without giving anything away, because, you know, I know, like, I gotta watch out for the giving anything away. I gotta watch out for, but I think there's just there will be more sort of mystery, and there's sort of like minor mysteries, and then like one or two major ones. I'm quite always happy when I write. I think it's the playwright in me of revealing it eventually, even if it's like sort of like a minor thing. I think when Saul doesn't tell Javier about the mass, for me, he was just like mad at his friend, right? Like he's on this journey, he's kind of mad at him. So I think ultimately what happens to them is in the realm of realism. But when they eventually go to Katrina, things about, without giving anything away, things about their friendship sort of, there's a fissure. There's a little bit of like the ways in which our closest and best friends in our lives can simultaneously disappoint us and but also make us love them even more. And so I think, you know, I don't want to give anything away, but there is something about their relationship that later on in the book sort of comes to a head. But ultimately, not giving anything away, ultimately there's love. I didn't want to do the whole like drama thing, you know, where they like ultimately there's love.
I think unless you know, folks, stop me if I'm wrong, I'm about to give it all away, because didn't we read, because that's my question to you tonight, was to ask about sort of that part when you wrote about the reveal of what actually happened to Javier and that conversation in their friendship around mystery, around disaster.
That does that. Yeah.
And, you know, you have a beautiful line that I typed as much as I could down, but it's a real simple line where after, you know, Saul is very clear, like he's like you're saying, he's mad at his friend. And he's like kind of looking at him like, I think you're obsessed with disaster. I think you're addicted to it. And he's contemplating within himself how like that also may be true for him. And there's a beautiful line. You say he wasn't driven by friendship, not an interesting story or a search for freedom, but a yearning for disaster as an obsession, as the infrastructure of the world. Disaster like guilt from earning, and then basically naming how like he's having disaster because as a journalist, he's earning a living off of people who are displaced from time and history. And I think feeling that doom in any relationship, friendship, romantic relationship, familial relationship, professional relationship, when, you know, the moment when you're like, damn, we're both so messed up, like how can we even be friends? And he comes to him and he kind of just says, yeah, Pana, you may be right. And he's like, we're both a little bit fucked, aren't we? And I just thought that was so simple and so beautiful. And as someone who's had to circumnavigate difficult relationships myself, I'm like, damn, everything I'm bringing to this, maybe I'm the problem, or everything they're bringing to this, they're the problem. And then understanding that like, oh no, because we're experiencing all these things at one time, like maybe we're a little fucked up.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that was so beautiful. And if you could talk a little bit more about
you. I think I think, and I at some point in the book I'd even written, I hope it's in these earlier pages, but like this, and if it's not, I hope it's not too much of a real reveal, but like this idea that like, I think when people tell stories, they're like painting this portrait of themselves, like, but in that painting, you know, sometimes they don't even know what's revealed. Like when you look at a work of art and you're like, someone else is going to see it in a different way. But like when you can sit down and sort of think and tell, especially with a loved one or a friend, I think you're painting this portrait of yourself, regardless of the story. The story could be about disaster, it could be about, you know, going to the gas station, it could be about an argument with like a family member, but you're always painting this sort of portrait of yourself. And I think I think sometimes we want to sort of like have this sensibility of we absolve or we forgive. I think sometimes love comes from just recognizing things like just day-to-day life or colonial powers that be. Like, I agree with you, and with that term, it fucks us all up a little bit. And I think recognizing that it's not necessarily like the first step in healing, but I think it's in the first step of recognizing that we could still sort of have that love for each other. And at the end of the day, I think too, it is a novel about friendships,
right?
And the ways in which friendships, you know, it's not like we create new family out of friends. It's like we create something different. We create something beautiful because we choose that. And yeah, I agree with you. Like when two friends are sitting down and they're like, well, we're both fucked up, but we still kind of have that love. Like, you know, I think that's a good place to come from. In the next sections, I think you'll read for the book, and it's on the first sentence. So they head to New Orleans together, you know? And so I think some of those ideas about disaster sort of like, they talk about it, but I think it gets put into like action a little bit in those other chapters. Yeah.
Yeah, and in fact, it's an extension of what I hear you naming is like, it's an extension of grace. It's showing grace. In that moment, there's enough grace for Javier for himself once he shows it to his friends to say, you know what, this is actually what happened to me. Let me tell you what happened.
Yeah.
To that truth. So like, gorgeous, beautiful transition, very gorgeous. Like, thank you
anytime,
so much.
Anytime a friend calls me up and be like, this is what happened, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna listen.
I hear you. Yeah. Wonderful. With a cool 25 minutes left. You see how time flies when we're having such a good time?
So good.
We have 25 minutes left. I want to continue to open up to questions, but I want to take a moment to revert to what Ron named in the chat. Next week, and again, Ron, I don't know if you've been experiencing this with us, but everyone has different pages of this book. Somehow everyone has different printed copies of this book. I have a different audience, you know? So Paula, if we can just do a little air clap. Woo, shout out to Paula. We have 2 Paulas in this group. That's how lit we are. Paula was able to share with us last week, I believe it was Paula, what the accurate titles or pages were. And we'll find them again, but I just wanted to like thank Paula publicly for doing that work, and anyone else who's been like, it's this page, no, it's this page, because this particular book, we all got different publications.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I'm sorry about that. You know, some books match up really well, even with the audio book, and then other books, like all the pages are kind of all over the place. So I do apologize.
No, we're an efficient group. Shout out to the group. Okay, here we go. I would love to reopen to any questions, comments, thoughts you'd love to share.
I think, Michael, just listening to you, you just have this deep reverence for your ancestors or older, you know, your grandfather, your uncles, and it rang through again. I think getting into this part of the book, this is where it felt like home to me, because my grandmother is from the Caribbean, and she would always do short stories. Like, it was not, I don't know all this psychiatry that y'all do. I'm not into psychiatry, but it was a story that was poignant to the point and got to where you wanted to go. So I could tell that through each character that you brought in, especially the older ones. It was,
thank you.
And I think for me, it was just, you were able to just in one sentence describe a whole situation. And I think that is hard to do. And I think that's reminded my grandmother, I'm like, I don't, all the words, all the psychiatry, let me just tell you this story. and you're going to figure out what you're supposed to learn from this.
Thank you. That means a lot. That really means the mundo, because I feel like, just to be totally forthcoming and share, like I'm writing the next book that I'm working on does sort of center on a Quechua ecologist, like a Quechua scientist. And what happened to my family in Ecuador is a lot of the Quechua history was just erased. The language was erased, and those stories from my abuelita, my grandmother, are not as prevalent as they were in my grandfather. And so there's some like pain too in like trying to recognize what was lost with ancestors. I'll give you an example of something I've been thinking about. My abuelita, she would say in Quechua, there's a term, causaguicho, and I hope I'm saying it correctly, but causaguicho. And she would say it, and she would say it, and she'd say it. And so when I was a kid, my dad was like, oh, she's saying like, how are you doing? But when it's translated exactly, what it means is, are you still alive? So when I was a kid, I'd go to Ecuador and I'd be like, okay, my abuelita's checking on me because like, I'm from Chicago. She's probably worried I'm climbing trees, like I'm knocking my head, I'm running around with my cousins. And I thought for years and years, she was just like checking on my health. Like, are you still, like kind of making fun of you? Like, and it wasn't until years later that, I'm researching for this next book, and I'm looking through this really amazing Quechua Spanish English dictionary that a friend of mine actually was involved in making. I have it right here, and I'm going through this dictionary and I'm seeing words that she would say, and it's like hitting me. Wow. It's like really hitting me like a bag of bricks or like a bag of like a hug, like, depending on the word.
Yeah.
And so I was doing a little bit of research with that word because I was just kind of just thinking about it. And I was talking to my dad about it, and he was like, well, we told you that as a kid, but what it really means is when you see somebody you haven't seen for a long time and you say, you're really asking them, are you truly living? Are you truly living? Almost like an unexamined life. It's like the Quechua say of like an unexamined life is not worth it. And it hit me because she's been gone for a long time. And it sort of just hits me in this sense of, yeah, abuelita, like, you've been gone a long time, but I'm going to try to like make sure I'm still, I think about that when playing with my kids. Put the phone away, like really enjoy this moment. Are you really living? Causaguicho. And it sort of like hit me. So like, I don't know what that means at all for the book I'm writing. I don't know how that's supposed to come across. But it just sort of like the power of just even like one word from our ancestors kind of has this hold on us. And it kind of just hit me out of the blue. It hit me more like a reader and like a grandson more than a writer in some ways.
Thank you for that. And thank you for naming what's prevalent for you now, right? Because that's what's going to help write whatever you have going on. Also, just want to do a mini shout out to Ecuador. We love Ecuador. My little brother's from Quito and Guayaquil. So, and he actually, and I'm going.
Nice.
So I'm actually really excited.
You're going?
Yeah, I gotta go see him. Yeah.
I love it. Nice. Oh,
serendipity. I want to name that. Renee asked a great question. Michael, what are you reading now? Also, I'm putting all this emphasis. Folks are way less intense than this. Michael, what are you reading now? Who are your favorite authors?
Who are my favorite authors? Ooh, I got a favorite authors. That's a big. So I have to say that probably like one of my favorite authors is well, I have a bunch. So probably the one that sort of like stuck with me over these past like 10, 15 years is there's this beautiful book, 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. He has really strange novellas that have really sort of like impacted me as a writer. Years ago, like I almost gave up on writing, and I read everything that was by him, Bolaño, and it just made me feel like I could write again for whatever reason. So he's always one of my favorites. I will just share with you the most favorite reading experience I've ever had in my life is a little bit old school and traditional, but it's Don Quixote. I mean, it's, the 500. I never realized how funny it is. It's like this bromance, like in like old school Spain, like they're making fun of each other, like heads are getting stuck in wells, like, it's just like, as far as a joyful experience. Writers who I'm reading right now, who I really love, is this book just came out, and she's a New York writer, but her name is Idra Novi. Take What You Need. She writes, she gets to the sort of like, she writes about Latin America, but this book really gets to sort of the pain of the nation today, you know, how divisive it is and how we're unable to sort of see past sort of like our ideologies. It's a beautiful novel. Take What You Need. This is, see, y'all are getting the high school teacher in me now. Like, let me see what's on my desk. This is a beautiful little book. Never Did the Fire. Charco Press. Charco Press is a small press out of England, but they do something that makes me love them, is they take a lot of Latin American literature and they're putting it excellent English translations. They're going through living people who published 100 years ago, and they're going through like an enormous, you know, and I read in Spanish and I read in English, but it's a joy to know that these books are available for English readers. Never Did the Fire. It's about, and I don't want to give it away, but it's about two failed revolutionaries toward the end of their lives, and they're living in they're in this really small cell, like they're still hiding from the government. And it's brutal in the ways in which they can't stand each other and love each other, because they've been through this life of like being revolutionaries together. I just think it's a gorgeous, it's just a gorgeous and difficult book. But those are some of the few ones that have been digging.
Thank you so much for those top leads. I just want to reiterate, if you're able to access our Zoom chat right now, the first link, the last 3 links I just posted, the first link is to 2666. The second link is to Take What You Need.
Which I have a copy of.
Ah, look at that.
Nice.
Oh, that book
and
just
I
makes
just wanted
my brain.
to say, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because now I see the connection between your writing. Because, I mean, I read Roberto Bolaño maybe 15, 20 years ago. And I just went from one book to the next, to the next, to the next.
Same.
And I had a friend who said, you know, I decided to take his book and read it from the back to the front.
Oh, wow. Ooh.
Like Savage Detectives. That's another one of his books.
Yeah.
And we were reading it in a book club, and everybody kind of read it the conventional way. And she said, no, I decided to read it from the back to the front.
I like
and
that.
It's like this real challenge to, you know, things being literal and having to make sense. And and this book is like, you know, it's like huge.
Yeah.
And it's crazy. It's all these really different stories all over the place. And now I really see the connection between, you know, like who's influenced you. Because the style of the book we're reading, you know, it's so drawn from this challenge, like you were saying, in Latin America. I didn't get it when you were first saying it, because, you know, I didn't make that connection, but like how the ability to say, no, we don't have to write a book that way. We can write it in any other way we want to, you know, and mix everything up, and everything doesn't have to be from front to back. Anyway.
Yeah, I 266 is, for me, I think it's probably, actually, it's probably the book that has influenced me most. Like almost at the point where I was like, I was deciding like, I'm not going to be a writer anymore. And somehow that book landed on the table, and I was like, never mind. This reading experience has like altered my brain to such a degree that I have no choice but to like just write. Because I also think like that book remains for me I won't get too much into it. I'm not teaching, you know, but it almost combines 19th and 20th century literature and projects what a 21st century literature could feel like. It takes all these traditions and all these narratives from Europe and from Latin America, Mexico, and it builds this universe. And I read that, and one of my immediate thoughts when finishing it was like, I could just truly, whether things are published or not, I could just truly write whatever the hell I want. Because Roberto Bolaño, he set the stage, and we're all just going to be these tiny little figures on his stage. And so why not? Because it'll be fun and weird, and, you know, kind of just F it. Like, but that book to me remains. I will say this, on my honeymoon, me and my wife decided to go to Spain, and I dragged my poor wife to the small town Blaines. It's like a, you know, working class, like getaway town with like hotels and fishing, and there's a small museum dedicated to him. And I found a bookseller who used to know him. I was in heaven. I found a bookseller who used to know him. I bought copies of the book from that same bookseller. That book for me has been so meaningful. So I'm so stoked to hear you read it.
That's beautiful. Any other questions, thoughts?
I did have a question about where are you as far as your playwriting is concerned? Are you still actively writing plays, or what's your focus?
Yeah, so I haven't written one in a long time, but I'll give you a little bit of a hint. Sort of the next book I'm working on, my idea for it was like a slim 200-page monologue. So even though it's a novel, when I'm writing it, I'm imagining this one story, this one actor on stage who's telling stories about different people and experiences, and it jumps around a little bit still, but it's coming from one mind. But I will be honest, when I miss the playwriting, it feels good right now to be working on a book where I could use the excuse of doing like monologue work. I'm kind of cheating.
No, that's really awesome.
What's the time frame on that? Is there a time frame?
Yeah, so I was supposed to turn it in last year, but I got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and there was this pandemic. So it's slow going. But hope, what is it, 23? So hope for it to be out like towards the end of 25. So barring, I have kids, so we'll see what happens, but it's in the process, yeah.
So that brings to mind, did you ever consider making this book into a screenplay?
That's a real good question, and no one's ever asked that, and I haven't actually. It would be, I think it could be fun, like excerpts of it to hear it on stage, and that would be kind of fun now that I'm thinking about it. Like take like some monologues and see if that'd be fun. But I haven't.
I know as a movie, the budget would seem like it would be prohibitive.
Yeah, nobody wants to make. Yeah.
Well, you can do it independently, and now that we have iPhones and
there you go, yeah.
So do it on a small budget. Take it to Sundance. You never know.
Who's your favorite female author?
Oh, this is so good. So I have two. Ursula K. Le Guin. She came, I always say like she science fiction writer, but she came to me at the right time in my life when I was young. And then I would say Clarice Lispector, and she's a Latin American author. She writes these really strange short novels. She wrote this short novel, The Passion of H.G., which is about this woman's encounter with a cockroach. And the novel lasts, it's like 150 pages in which she has this encounter with this cockroach, but she's living through her life, like memories of her life. And she's beautiful and intense. And a lot of her work is translated. All of her short stories and novellas have been translated within the last 15 years. And I just love her work. I love both of those writers so much.
Thank you.
And I think,
can you put those in the chat?
Mm.
Are you able to put those in the chat?
Yeah, let me throw Clarice.
Thank you.
And I think Letitia just held up her copy of one of Ursula's Le Guin's most recent books.
Yeah, I've just read. It's not a fiction book, but it's a very thin book. Like the name is Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. It's very good. Like it's a theory demonstrating the importance of the carrier bags for the female stuff, not because usually we take it for granted, like the heroes and the arrows and and she said that what changed the world wasn't that, like, but the women stuff, like, to go there and to pick up stuff and to carry it and so, like, just fall in love with this thin book.
I love her in some of her speeches too. She's just so, I think coming from that world of science fiction, she doesn't hold bars. I think there's an old speech I saw of her where she was like, if you want to know who truly saved the planet in the 20th century, she says, no holds barred. She says socialist feminists. She says the collective groups who fought for everything that we still hold dear. I love her. Yeah, I have not read that, and now I'm gonna buy it tomorrow. I have not read the theory book.
Very thin, and the introduction is made by Donna Haraway.
Oh, nice.
And I'm Brazilian, and Clarice Lispector is like one of the most beloved author.
I know, and it's so even common to say, but I will say this: I'm so jealous of countries where someone so powerfully strange as could be such a goddess, such like this. Where the United States, we have those for sure, but she's these outer limits. She's extraordinary. I adore her.
Thank you.
So with 6 minutes left of our discussion, I'd love to just sort of hone in. We've spoken tonight about a couple of different themes, particularly about how we as people navigate the present before us while calling in what has already happened in the past and what may still be able to navigate our future. And I guess my question to you is, ultimately, what do you want readers to take away from this?
Oh, that is a good one. that's a hard one.
I told you we're a good one. We're good.
You're very good. Yeah. I got it. If there was anything to take away, this is something a friend told me. Who is just a voracious reader and is a labor lawyer. So he's really involved in helping people organize at the workplace. And I really love his perspective. And I think when he said that, I was like, oh, I hope that came across a little bit. And I didn't even know I was trying to intend any readers would want. But he said when he was reading it, and for me, I really hold this dear to my heart, is he said that there's no villains necessarily in the book. And so many of the people just subsist and are able to survive by just making small, decent decisions to help each other. And I didn't know that. I didn't know that writing it. I didn't necessarily think it was intentful, but I think it was really powerful for him being a labor lawyer. He does deal with villains. He deals with the companies that are stealing labor and trying to undermine working people. And so when he said that, I think it really affected me a lot, because not having like easy answers about the ways in which sort of the American literary spectrum is like, again, we survive because of our own perseverance. There's something that's always made me feel uncomfortable about that, because yes, we got to persevere. We all go through things individually and as families that we have to do, but it doesn't happen without the small sort of beautiful things that other people do for us along the way. Like my family had COVID in, the 2 Novembers ago, and locked down with 2 little kids, and like every day someone just put like one dinner, like whether it was Grubhub or whether it was somebody coming by with tacos and leaving in our front door. There's just like that small grace made it, survivable. And I think in my writing, like in Lost Book of Adana Moreau, I didn't recognize that was happening. But when he told me that, I was like, oh shit, thank you. Like, I'm just going to walk away with that for a long time. And just to know that you'll see later on, so many of the characters are able to survive pretty tough things, especially with Katrina, by these small acts of survival and helping each other. So yeah, I don't know if that's what people take away, but like he took away from that, and I sort of put it in my corazon, and I'm going to walk away with it. Like, try to think about that more for next books.
Absolutely. That's beautiful. Thank you. And just even thinking how excuse me, often the story of perseverance told through our bodies, like that is a story, right? And perseverance with the acts of like kindness, love, gratitude, grace becomes something greater. It becomes magical almost, right? And I think that's also what I so like that's dope. Well, it is 8:28. Anyone could interject at this time, but I'm going to officially close the loop because we're going to be on for the next 2 minutes. I really want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Michael, for coming in. I love when an author comes midway in the book because we actually haven't even come to any real conclusions yet. Like, we're just still in it, you know? So I appreciate you being in community with us tonight and like being able to experience the brilliance of like the scholars and the folks here. As y'all know, I love you so much. It's my pleasure to be at book club every Tuesday. This is amazing. We can open it up for the last 2 minutes, but thank you all.